The wartime circumstances of Indigenous people are unique. Indigenous military historian Danielle Taye from the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa joins us now. And thanks for joining us. And I understand your position here at the museum is fairly new because not a lot is known about Indigenous military history.
That's right. It's a growing field. So I've actually only been in this position for about a year now.
And the circumstances are complicated.
Absolutely.
Yes. So people would think, why would people want to serve a country where they don't have full rights?
Yes, and that's a great question for a lot of people to ask. And there's a whole bunch of reasons, actually, why Indigenous people decided to serve in the World Wars. Some of them ranged from just getting 3 square meals a day, having a roof over their head, having clothing. But some of them were more complex, almost political reasons. Tommy Prince, a famous Indigenous soldier from the Second World War and from Korea, actually talked about joining up in order to show that First Nations recruits were as good as any white man.
And then once they got to the fields, both in the First World War and Second World War, they got a bit of a taste of equality that they didn't have back in Canada.
That's exactly right. So at home in Canada, at the time there were really discriminatory and oppressive government policies.
Under the Indian Act.
Under the Indian Act. And these things dictated things like their movements, their economic prospects, their education, even their ability to practice cultural practices in some cases. And so the experience of going overseas for many soldiers was they were treated as equals with their non-Indigenous counterparts. And that was a very new experience for many of them.
And then they come home.
Yes, and then they come home. Many of them had high hopes that that equality that transcended race overseas would continue when they came back, and unfortunately that was not the case. You
have an example of a woman with connections whose grandson, I understand, works here. A woman from Six Nations who wanted to be a nurse, wanted to train in Canada, and couldn't.
Absolutely, yeah. So her name was Edith Anderson Montour, and she was from Six Nations of the Grand River near Brantford, Ontario. Born in 1890, she did want to become a nurse, but she wouldn't have been admitted to receive her nurse training in Canada because of her status as a First Nations woman at the time. So she went down to New York and she did her training there, and eventually actually served in the American Expeditionary Force once the Americans joined the First World War in 1917.
So what do you hope that people get from, like you said that you have people ask, why is there a separate Indigenous Remembrance Day?
Yeah, so we do have Indigenous Veterans Day that is observed every November 8th, and that began in the mid-1990s. And part of the reason for that is a recognition that Indigenous people were not treated the same after they returned home. They were not given the same supports, unfortunately. So things like veterans benefits, so land grants, pensions, things like that, many Indigenous veterans were denied those supports when they returned home. And so for many decades, Indigenous people were not recognized for their service. So there was a big disconnect there between the significance of their sacrifices and their social, political, and economic circumstances. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's so important, I think.
Has that changed?
Yes, it's starting to change. I think there's always more work to be done, but we are obviously seeing more recognition now with Indigenous Veterans Day. Indigenous groups are laying wreaths on Remembrance Day at the cenotaph, which they were not actually permitted to do until the 1990s.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so much more to learn, and you're trying to grow the collection as well here.
Absolutely.
As a way of getting more stories out there. So Danielle, thanks very much for joining us, and we're going to have lots more information of where you can find more information about Indigenous military history. Go to the museum's website. We'll have a link up at chch.com/morninglive.